Kenneth Eugene Smith spent 28 years waiting to die. On January 25, 2024, Alabama finally carried out its execution using a method never tried on a human being. It was the state's second attempt to end his life. But the road to that night started decades earlier, with a preacher who ordered his own wife's murder. It began with a plan, one set in motion by a man of the church. Every case we cover isn't just about crime. It's about choices, consequences, and the lives forever changed. If you want more stories that dig deep into the truth behind the headlines, don't just watch, join the community. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and be part of uncovering the next story together. In 1988, Reverend Charles Sennett was seen by many as a respected preacher in northwestern Alabama. But behind the pulpit, his life was falling apart. He was drowning in tens of thousands of dollars in debt and carrying on an affair. His reputation, his finances, and his double life were crumbling. Rather than face shame, he plotted an unthinkable solution: kill his wife, Elizabeth Dorene Sennett, a 45-year-old mother of two. If she were gone, he could collect the insurance money and start fresh. On March 18, 1988, police were called to the Sennett home. Inside, they discovered Elizabeth's body. She had been found with severe injuries, leaving little doubt that this was a targeted homicide. As detectives began to investigate, the truth surfaced quickly. All signs pointed back to Charles himself. The Reverend had paid men to carry out the homicide, hoping it would solve his financial problems. But before police could arrest him, Charles Sennett took his own life. That left the men he had hired to face justice. Among them was Kenneth Eugene Smith. He and his accomplices were arrested, and prosecutors built their case. It all began on a single fateful day. Reverend Charles Sennett Sr. hired one of his tenants, Billy Gray Williams, to end the life of his wife, 45-year-old Elizabeth Dorene Sennett. But Williams wouldn't act alone. To carry out the plan, he brought in two more men, Kenneth Smith, just 22 years old, and John Forrest Parker. The deal was cold and simple. Each man would be paid $1,000 to end Elizabeth's life. On March 18, 1988, the plan was put into motion. That morning, Elizabeth was at home in Colbert County, Alabama. Smith and Parker arrived at her door, posing as hunters who had her husband's permission to scout the land. Suspicious, Elizabeth called Charles to confirm. He reassured her it was fine. What Elizabeth didn't know was that her husband had already paid the men to carry out her murder. Instead of buying the gun they were supposed to use, Smith and Parker spent the money on drugs. Left without a firearm, they decided to improvise. Elizabeth, still unsuspecting, let the men inside. She remained in the house while they walked around the property. Minutes later, they returned, asking if they could use the bathroom. Trusting them, she agreed. As Parker stepped into the bathroom, Smith suddenly attacked from behind, striking Elizabeth without warning. The violence escalated quickly. She fought with everything she had, but the two men were relentless. They grabbed whatever they could find, a fireplace poker, a walking cane, even a length of galvanized pipe, beating her mercilessly. Finally, they resorted to a 6-inch survival knife, stabbing Elizabeth again and again. 8 deep wounds marked the brutal end of a woman who had trusted them at her own door. Those brutal wounds proved fatal. Sheriff Ronnie May was among the first to reach the Sennett home. Inside, he discovered Elizabeth lying on the floor, her body broken but not yet still. To his touch, there was no pulse. Moments later, paramedics rushed in and managed to detect the faintest sign of life. For a moment, there was hope. But that hope quickly faded. At the hospital, doctors confirmed what May already knew deep down. Elizabeth Sennett was gone. Later, May would reflect on the scene with heavy words. She fought it, and she fought hard. Detectives quickly realized the scene didn't add up. The house showed no signs of the struggle that had taken place. As if someone wanted it to appear like a home invasion. A video cassette recorder and a stereo had been taken, but more valuable items were untouched. It looked staged. Within a week, a tip to Crime Stoppers named the men involved. On March 25, just 1 week after the murder, Charles Sennett was brought in for questioning. He denied any involvement, but when an investigator casually mentioned the name Kenneth Smith, his face flushed red. After the interview, Charles left the station and drove straight to his church. There, in a moment of crushing guilt, he confessed to his sons and their families. He admitted he was having an affair and that he had arranged their mother's death. Minutes later, he walked into the parking lot, sat in his truck, and pulled the trigger. But his death didn't close the case. With a search warrant, investigators combed through Kenneth Smith's home. Inside, they discovered a VCR stolen from the Sennett residence. When confronted, both Smith and John Parker gave statements that tied them directly to the crime. There was no escaping it now. For just $1,000, Kenneth Eugene Smith had taken part in an unspeakable act, and the law was ready to make him answer for it. Smith's legal saga stretched on for decades. In 1989, he was convicted and sentenced to death. That verdict was overturned in 1992. He went to trial again in 1996. This time, the jury voted 11-1 for life without parole, but Alabama law allowed judges to override jury recommendations. The judge sentenced Smith to death anyway. His accomplices met their fates along the same grim path. John Forrest Parker, who had joined him in the brutal homicide, was executed by lethal injection in 2010. Billy Gray Williams, the middleman who arranged the contract on Elizabeth's life, died of illness in prison in 2020. Smith remained, appealing again and again, but every attempt failed. In November 2022, the state of Alabama prepared to carry out Smith's execution by lethal injection. The night was chaotic. His attorneys were still filing last-minute appeals when prison officials marched him toward the chamber. Smith felt the sharp sting of a needle as executioners searched for a vein. He warned them they were pushing into muscle, not a vein, but they ignored him. Strapped to the gurney, he later described his position as an inverted crucifixion, his arms pinned upward, his body twisted in agony. Minutes dragged by. The team left, then returned with syringes filled with an unknown substance. At 10:20 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court lifted the stay on his execution, and his death was officially cleared to proceed. But the team still couldn't find a usable vein. Needles were driven again and again, even into his collarbone, as they attempted to force a central line. The pain was excruciating. Still, nothing worked. As the clock edged toward midnight, the scene turned desperate. By 11:20 p.m., after more than an hour of failed attempts, Alabama finally called it off. Smith was left drenched in sweat, hyperventilating, and too weak to lift his arms. He had come within minutes of death, only for it to collapse into what would later be called Alabama's third consecutive botched execution. After the failed execution attempt, the state faced harsh criticism. Governor Kay Ivey ordered a review, but behind closed doors, Alabama officials began planning something new. In 2023, Attorney General Steve Marshall petitioned the court to schedule Smith's execution again. But this time, he didn't request lethal injection. Instead, he asked for a first-of-its-kind method, nitrogen hypoxia. The idea was simple but chilling. Strap a mask over the prisoner's face and replace oxygen with pure nitrogen until the body shuts down. Supporters claimed it would be painless. Critics called it experimental and potentially torturous. The United Nations warned it could violate human rights. Despite the controversy, the courts allowed Alabama to proceed. Smith's execution was set for January 25, 2024. That morning, inside Holman Correctional Facility, Smith sat awake in his cell. He was 58 years old and had spent more than half his life on death row. He ate his last meal, steak, hash browns, and eggs, in silence. Hours later, he was granted a final visit with his wife and sons. Every word carried the weight of finality. As the evening approached, his spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, prayed with him. Hood later said Smith was calm, though afraid of the unknown. At 7:53 p.m., guards led Smith into the chamber. He was strapped to the gurney, restraints tight across his wrists, ankles, and chest. A full face mask was sealed over his head. Behind glass, witnesses filed in, including members of Elizabeth's family. When asked for his final words, Smith spoke clearly. "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards. Thank you for supporting me. Love all of you." Moments later, nitrogen gas began to flow. Witnesses described Smith thrashing violently, his body straining against the straps, gasping for air. For several minutes, the sound of his desperate breathing filled the chamber before it slowed. At 8:15 p.m., the curtain was drawn. At 8:25 p.m., Kenneth Eugene Smith was pronounced dead. He was the first person in history executed by nitrogen hypoxia. Human rights groups condemned the execution. The United Nations called it cruel and degrading. Yet Alabama pressed forward. Just months later, another inmate, Alan Eugene Miller, became the second man executed this way. Other states began exploring the method as well. But history will always remember Kenneth Eugene Smith as the first, the man who survived a botched lethal injection only to face an untested method of death. For Elizabeth Sennett's family, justice had finally been served after 36 long years. For the world, Smith's execution opened a new and deeply controversial chapter in America's death penalty. This case reminds us of the dark choices people make when consumed by greed, debt, and desperation, and the lasting consequences those choices bring. One decision by a preacher to end his wife's life set in motion decades of tragedy, pain, and controversy. It shows how a single crime doesn't just take a life, it can ripple through families, communities, and even history itself.